Yesterday, Donald Trump, as had long been trailed, delivered what he described as
Liberation Day.
The Economist had another name for it, and they weren't alone. In announcing the wide-ranging tariffs that Trump was imposing on imports into the United States, he gave a little insight into the economic theory driving his actions.
For years, hardworking American citizens were forced to sit on the sidelines as other nations got rich and powerful, much of it at our expense. But now it's our turn to prosper, and in so doing, use trillions and trillions of dollars to reduce our taxes and pay down our national debt, and it'll all happen very quickly.
Not all economists were entirely convinced. Here was one asked to comment on the tariffs immediately after Trump had finished speaking on English language French TV.
Professor of US and International Politics. Scott, we spoke to you a little bit earlier. Now that we've heard what the detail is from Donald Trump, what do you make of all of that?
Before talking about the effects, and they're bad, let me just say that I think that was the dumbest, most economically illiterate speech I have heard in my life. And I've heard a lot of bad ones.
Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce, was asked to defend the policy as global stock markets plummeted on the news, and he said American markets were going to do, quote, extremely well in the medium to longer term because reasons. He said he expected most countries to start to really examine their trade policy towards the United States of America and stop picking on us. How is the entire world picking on the poor old United States, you might be wondering? Well, Trump produced a chart that showed it in black and white. In one column was the tariffs that those countries were imposing on the United States, and then in another column, the US showed the reciprocal tariffs that Trump was fighting back with. Except various economists looked at those figures, and that's not remotely what they seem to show.
The idea that the European Union has a 39% tariff rate on the United States, the weighted average of EU tariffs on the US is 1%.
Eventually, they came back with the formula. We knew that Trump has it in his head that a trade deficit with a country means somehow that that country is, quote, taking advantage of America. This is what economics experts generally call total bollocks. If you decide to buy a German car because you like German cars, obviously that is not Germany somehow cheating the US and getting one over on it. It turns out that they did not calculate tariff rates and other non-tariff barriers that countries were imposing on the US, as they claimed. Rather, they took the trade deficit with that country and divided it by the country's exports to the US. And if a country had a trade surplus with that country, or the deficit was less than 10%, well, it slapped a 10% tariff on that country anyway, because rock and roll, baby. That's probably how the US ended up slapping 10% tariffs on the Heard and McDonald Islands, a fact that caught the notice of the internet today. There it is, tariffs charged to the USA by the dastardly Heard and McDonald Islands, 10%. So the USA is slapping back with 10% tariffs. Take that, penguins. Because yes, as the internet was quick to point out, those islands are uninhabited by humans. They are solely occupied by penguins. And on the news of the tariffs being imposed on them, well, they seemed largely unbothered. Nerves of steel, those birds. Which is all very amusing, but of course this event caught the attention of the world because for everyone else it was anything but funny. The expectation is that the global imposition of tariffs like this will damage the economy of the entire world. Really, one man develops a fixation on tariffs. Almost everyone around him thinks that on this issue at least he's barking. But nobody will say anything, at least nobody that he might actually listen to. So he holds a big event in the Rose Garden to celebrate this huge act of economic sabotage on every country, including his own. And he invites people in to cheer him doing it. This will become one of the classic pieces of footage shown in the future as people talk about the global recession of the 2020s. Some of those hit the hardest by the tariffs have been countries in Asia, where America's interest in reducing its exposure to manufacturing supply chains in China had led it to building up alternative supply chains. So Vietnam, Cambodia and Thailand were hit by some of the largest tariffs because, yes, they responded to America's former desires. They sold a lot more goods into the US than they bought from the US as a result. So Vietnam got 46% tariffs, Thailand 37%, Cambodia 49%. These are pretty devastating figures for those countries. Hitting goods coming from there will raise prices for American consumers significantly and lay waste to a large number of jobs in the places that, I remind you, had responded to American demand by citing those jobs in there. It will also hurt American companies whose supply chains depend on them. Technology companies like Intel and Samsung, apparel makers like Nike, all expected to be badly hit. For example, if you take Vietnam, Indonesia and China altogether, that constitutes 95% of all Nike shoes manufacturing. Jayati Ghosh, economist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, said, even the countries that are not facing high tariffs are going to be in trouble. You will get much lower investment and lower economic activity and lower employment. It's not just a direct impact of the specific tariff against your country, but it's the overall impact of the chaos it's bringing about in the trading system. A number of countries were considering whether they should respond to the tariffs with tariffs of their own levied against the United States, bearing in mind that most of them do not levy the tariff numbers that Trump is claiming, not at the rates that he's claiming anyway. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent warned those countries do not retaliate, as though somehow that's his call. He said this, if you retaliate, there will be escalation. If you don't retaliate, this is the high watermark. Russia does not appear on the list of tariffed countries for some reason. Scott Bessent claimed that the reason was because the US doesn't trade with Russia since they're sanctioned. But that's not actually true. I know, an untrue thing. I'm shocked. According to the figures given by the US government's own Office of the US Trade Representative, the US does do $3.5 billion of trade with Russia, even with sanctions, which I'm betting is significantly more than they do with the penguins. I could be wrong. There is an open question whether all these tariffs are actually legal. It's supposed to be Congress that sets tariffs with foreign countries, not the actual President of the United States. Trump has justified his actions with reference to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Inu Manak, a trade expert at the Council on Foreign Relations, told the New York Times that the tariffs previously imposed against Canada, China and Mexico really stretched interpretation of that particular law, and said this action takes it even further, using the false claim that the trade deficit is somehow reflective of trade barriers. The question is, who would bring a legal challenge against these tariffs, knowing the punitive response they would likely get from the administration if they did so? Well, it's possible. Just yesterday, the Senate voted to rescind some of Trump's tariffs on Canada, a vote that required a handful of Republicans to break ranks in order to pass. Now, that bill got through the Senate. It almost certainly won't make it through the House. But it did give a signal of a growing sense of unease amongst some of the Republican ranks about this part of President Trump's agenda. Just remember, all Republicans who think that the standard laws of economics as they've understood them for decades still apply, they will be convinced in their own minds that what Trump is doing is going to egregiously damage America and the world. That having promised to bring prices down, he's going to ensure that they are raised for everybody. They know this because they've started talking about short-term pain for long-term gain. But if the long-term gain is based on magical thinking, and plenty of those Republicans believe it to be so, then they're going to be getting more and more unhappy about it, particularly as the midterms approach. Trump's theory is that all these tariffs, not seen since the 1930s, when they helped cause a global depression, will lead to a renaissance in manufacturing in the United States. Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, he said. Now, there's no doubt that the deindustrialization of America created difficulties and pain for some communities that had been ignored for a long period. While American consumers benefited from an era of cheap goods, some of those who had lost factory jobs never recovered the sort of position that they had. While all of that was happening, America nevertheless became the most financially successful country on the planet and saw rates of economic growth and prosperity no other country has come close to matching. But now it's feeling hard done by, and on behalf of the workers who lost out on globalization. The thing is, none of these processes have zero victims. All of them are based on trade-offs. So yes, maybe America can bring back some of those manufacturing jobs with tariffs. Plenty are sceptical, but there's no doubt that some will build new factories over the coming decade. The cost of achieving that will be an end to the era of cheap goods. More of those goods will be made by Americans who get paid higher wages, so the goods cost more, and those that are still imported will come through high tariff rates, so will cost more. You benefit one group of workers to the disbenefit of the broadest group of consumers whose salaries are suddenly no longer enough to continue the lives at the level they've gotten used to living them. Unfortunately, it does all of that while also producing what is likely to be a global recession. America's not going to feel its pain alone. It's going to share it out. Having built a global supply chain because it suited America's interests, as it understood them at the time, it has now not implemented a slow and well-planned change in direction. It has just created an immediate chaotic break. People are going to starve in a number of countries because of what has just been done. Not a problem for Americans, because they will likely starve conveniently out of their sight, hence out of their mind. And the world is learning the lesson the hard way. Never allow your economy to be vulnerably exposed to the United States ever again, even if it changes its mind in the future. For some, that's an aspirational lesson, because they're in so deep they have no choice but to give Trump exactly what he wants, multiple sessions where they treat him like a great man, flatter and grovel to him for some consideration in the short term. Lots will have to do that on behalf of their nations. A number of them will be granted favours as a result by the glorious world emperor. But in 50 years' time, if I'm still here when I'm 110, we'll be able to trace the global trading structure's shape back to this moment when many countries learned their lesson the hard way. Oh, and expect America to whine about it as it happens. I couldn't help but chuckle to see that the US has been complaining about the fact that Europe, in looking to boost its own defence spending, has been very clear that it's going to buy those weapons from European sources, along with certain trade partners only. In other words, no American weapons. How dare you, the Americans have said. What do you mean you won't buy our weapons that would depend on our spare parts and our operational intelligence to even work? Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that any exclusion of US companies from European tenders would be seen negatively by Washington. Be interesting to know how different that's going to look from what we see already, especially since the Signalgate leak showing just how much certain members of the administration seem to actively hate Europe. But there you go. Actions, consequences. You must be fed up of hearing me talk about it, but you'd better get used to it, because what Trump did in the Rose Garden yesterday is going to be the most consequential thing a single human being has done in our lifetimes. And according to all the experts, and even an island load of penguins, not in a good way.